Good afternoon. Welcome to Virology. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and I am going to be your professor for this entire course. I am a professor up at the medical school. I have had a lab there for 38 years working on viruses. And I think they are the coolest things on the planet, cooler than anything else that exists. And part of my goal is to convince you that they're really amazing. I absolutely love viruses. I have a passion for them that few people have, and I want to impart some of that to you. Now, as a professor at a medical school, I have zero teaching obligations. I don't have to teach this course. I've been doing this for 10 years because I want you down here on this campus to know about viruses. When I started doing this 10 years ago, there was no virology course at Morningside, and I thought, you guys are paying 60 grand a year and you're not learning about viruses. This is completely unacceptable. So that's my motivation. And I guarantee you, you're gonna really like this course. You're gonna like what you learn. It's not easy, but in the end, you're gonna know more about viruses than most people on Earth. And this is a great time to be taking this course because, as you know, we have a brand new virus emerging from China and circulating around the globe. And everything you have heard about it on Twitter and Facebook and so forth is probably wrong. But here you're going to get the facts. By the end of this course, you're going to understand exactly what is going on. Here's what I feel. If you want to understand life, if you want to understand human health and human disease, you need to know about viruses. We live and prosper in a literal cloud of viruses. Viruses infect every living thing on the planet. Everything. Nothing escapes a virus infection.
This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick.
So I'm sure you're very prepared because you knew this was going to happen. Do you feel like you prepared for this? I mean, even though this probably surprised you beyond what you expected.
Well, the goal of the 2015 talk and the detailed article in the New England Journal of Medicine was so that the government would do the work to be ready for the next epidemic. And that would have meant that we would have had diagnostics very quickly, drugs very quickly, and even a vaccine. All of those things dramatically faster than what we're going through here.
Hi everybody, I'm Vincent Racaniello, and this is TWIV. Today's May 7th, 2020, and as everyone knows, we're in the middle of a pandemic caused by SARS-CoV-2. This pandemic could have been prevented. We knew after SARS-1, which ended in 2003, that bats in China harbor SARS-like coronaviruses, some of which have pandemic potential. And so what we needed to do then was to isolate some of those viruses and design antiviral drugs and maybe even vaccines that could inhibit a broad range of them, what we call pan-coronavirus therapeutics. Of course, no one did that because there was no financial incentive. SARS-1 disappeared in 2003, and the companies that make drugs for us to keep us healthy, they didn't see a profit to be made, so no research was done. And therefore, in 2019, when SARS-CoV-2 emerged, there was nothing we could do to stop it.
Over the last 5 years, the foundation and others did make investments in things like a coalition called Cepi that will help get the vaccine out faster than would have otherwise been the case. But only about 5% of what should have been done to get ready for this, because this is even, worse than war, and yet the amount that was put into it, the amount we practiced and had, the ability to make these tools, virtually nothing was done.
I think that can change if we make our drugs and vaccines in different ways, not by for-profit companies. And today's talk is an interview I did back in December of 2019 when I was in Singapore. It's a chat with the CEO of an organization called Cepi, Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. We're recording today at the Nipah Virus International Conference in Singapore, which recognizes the discovery of this virus 20 years ago. My guest is the CEO of Cepi, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, Richard Hatchett. Welcome to TWIV.
Hi, Vincent. Nice to be here. Thanks.
And also joining me from Duke National University of Singapore Medical School and a co-organizer of this conference, Lin-Fa Wang. Welcome.
Thank you, Vincent. Yeah, glad to be on TWIV again.
Yeah, you were on 200 and something.
That's right. Yeah.
Which we called the real Batman. He is the real Batman, I think.
That was down in Australia. That's right. Yeah.
And that was in Geelong.
Yeah.
That we recorded that. So thanks for having me at this wonderful conference. I want to talk about Cepi today. I want our listeners, which are quite numerous, both scientists and non-scientists, I want them to learn about Cepi. So let's start by finding out what it is.
Great, sure. The Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations is a new organization. It was established in January of 2017. It was inspired, the reason that it was set up was a recognition that emerging epidemic viruses presented a threat and that the international community was not organized to develop vaccines against them. The problem with epidemic diseases obviously is they're rare. Market forces don't really drive the development of vaccines because vaccine development takes a long time. It's risky. Cepi was set up as a collaborative effort of a number of sovereign countries, as well as philanthropic donors, including the Gates Foundation and Wellcome, to collect funds to support vaccine development efforts against diseases like Ebola, including Nipah, Lassa, MERS, and other emerging viruses.
So is this your idea?
No, it was really an idea that a group of global health leaders came together. I did participate in some of the planning efforts, but people like Jeremy Farr, Bill Gates, Victor Thao from the National Academy of Medicines, and other global health leaders all collectively realized that we needed to do something to prevent a recurrence of something like the West African Ebola epidemic.
So the Gates Foundation on its own wouldn't be appropriate to do this sort of work?
I think they saw the value of creating a dedicated product development partnership that could focus exclusively on this work, given the very particular challenges of developing these types of vaccines against these types of threats.
Okay.
And before 2013, I don't think anyone would have argued that an Ebola vaccine was absolutely necessary for global health purposes. Post West Africa, I don't think anybody would argue that it's essential. And I think the concern with Nipah is that, like Ebola, the range of the reservoir species is vast. There are at least 2 billion people living in areas where Nipah emergence might occur. And what you need is a combination of a transmissible virus and the right social milieu in which that virus has the potential to explode, which is what Ebola found in West Africa after being a known disease for 40 years. We've known about Nipah for 20 years. We've seen large outbreaks. What we haven't seen is a West Africa equivalent, and that's what we're hoping we can prevent.
Yeah. We don't want to have that be the impetus for another vaccine of a different sort, right? It seems to me from listening at this meeting, there's growing enthusiasm for the idea of making vaccines against rare but potentially devastating viruses and stockpiling them in case of an outbreak. Is that a reasonable reading of what's going on?
I think so. One of the points that I've made in a number of venues is that emerging epidemic diseases represent a threat which in many ways is characteristic of the world we've created for ourselves. It's the downside of our interconnected world. It reflects both ecological factors, climate change, incursions into remote areas, obviously, but also the interconnected nature of the world and increasingly dense and well-connected populations. So I think we shouldn't think about epidemic diseases and we shouldn't put them into the balance exclusively with other global health problems like HIV, TB, or malaria, because then it becomes a zero-sum game. And we want to prevent that. I think we need to look at epidemic diseases like we look at other transnational problems that require a collective response, like international terrorism, like climate change, or even like cybersecurity. It's just an emergent risk because of the world that we've created for ourselves.
I'm curious about your background that brought you to this current position. Tell us about your training.
Well, interestingly, I'm a medical oncologist by training. Although I did have a long interest in infectious diseases, and I had done Ebola work in Central Africa back in the late 1990s. How I ended up in public health preparedness is almost by happenstance. I happened to get involved in the response to September 11th in New York City. Happened to run what became the main medical triage area at Ground Zero, providing medical support to search and rescue workers. And as a result of that, veered into public health preparedness. Before coming to Cepi, I worked for about 15 years in the U.S. government in the biodefense programs. Because of my background in medical oncology, I actually worked on radiation countermeasures. So drugs and treatments to treat people who'd been exposed to high doses of radiation in a terrorist context. And then moved to an organization called BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, that develops vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics for terrorism threats, and gained a lot of relevant experience for the challenges that Cepi faces.
I've had a few BARDA people on my podcast, Mike Merchelinsky,
Sure.
Ed Niles, another, and I've learned a lot about what they do, and I can see how you would go from BARDA to Cepi for sure.
Well, you know, the interesting thing when I was asked to consider the role at Cepi, I mean, in many ways, the configuration of the problem is very similar. You're trying to develop medical products for diseases that don't really occur very often, at least in natural settings. So you don't have opportunities for demonstrating efficacy. You do have these challenges. The market's not driving the innovation that you need, but clearly there's a strategic interest in having the products. The difference between BARDA and operating in Cepi, and the challenge that I foresaw for Cepi, was that at BARDA you at least had the benefit of operating, at least in theory, under a single government, where your regulatory partner, your agency that was going to deliver the products, in this case CDC, and your upstream funding partners, who were NIH and Department of Defense research groups, were all nominally working together for a single end. With Cepi, you're operating in a multilateral environment where all of the organizations that are contributing have their own priorities, their own agendas, and it's all really truly a coalition of the willing, and there's no command authority.
That's right.
So Cepi is a co-sponsor of this meeting, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I know Linfa said you put it together in 6 months.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
That's right. I think
Done a great job, right?
He's done a remarkable job.
Thank you.
It's an outstanding turnout
Yeah.
for the meeting.
Yeah.
I'm always amazed that Lassa, which causes far more disease in Africa than Ebola,
Yeah.
still there's no vaccine. And I have to tell you that there is a book about Lassa discovery called Fever by John Fuller,
Yeah.
which I read in the early 70s, and that's what inspired me to be a virologist. So Lassa has a very important part in my career.
Yeah.
So what did you hope to accomplish by co-sponsoring this Nipah virus meeting?
Well, Cepi as an organization, I mean, we've selected Nipah as one of 5 viruses in addition to Ebola that we're focusing on. So we've already invested in the development of 4 Nipah vaccines, and we have these candidates that are moving along, that we're hoping to move into clinical trials in humans next year. And of course, Nipah, we had the outbreak in Kerala last year that kind of raised the profile of Nipah again. I think we saw an opportunity, which I'm glad Lenfa embraced, to bring the community together, to inject energy into the community, and not exclusively to focus on Cepi's activities, because there is also progress on a potential therapeutic, a monoclonal antibody, as you're probably aware, and there's a need for point-of-care diagnostics, and there is, as we heard in one of the presentations yesterday, there is kind of a virtuous circle. If you have therapeutics that you can offer, or vaccines that you can administer, there's more of a incentive to use diagnostics and to increase your surveillance and increase your understanding of the epidemiology of the diseases. And by bringing the community together, and our goal is, through our partnerships and through the international partnerships, to focus attention and basically say to the world community, let's go ahead and focus on Nipah for the next several years. Let's take it off the table. Let's move these products forward. Let's improve our surveillance, improve our diagnostics. Nipah is a dangerous disease, but there's no reason that we have to let a West Africa happen in order to address this threat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The funds that we're injecting into the system to support the vaccine development and to support some of the enabling science that goes along with that. I mean, we're supporting epidemiology studies, we're supporting the development of standards and assays against the pathogens that we're targeting, actually sort of exerts a magnetic draw, and it pulls other researchers in, and it creates momentum across the whole array of countermeasures. And what we're really trying to do as Cepi, and the C in Cepi, the coalition aspect, is really important. We're not only trying to be a product development partnership that is investing in particular products, we're actually trying to change and create an ecosystem that is conducive to the development and ultimately the sustainability of these products. And that includes working with partners like Gavi and UNICEF and WHO to establish stockpiles and create criteria for deploying those stockpiles using the products, but also creating understanding and awareness of the pathogens and a demand for products to address them.
So at what stage do you support this work? Do you start, if someone had a platform idea, would you support that? Mm-hmm. Would you do preclinical all the way through to phase 1, 2, and 3?
So right now, in the funding that we have secured is for the first 5 years of Cepi's existence, and so we're about almost halfway through that cycle, maybe slightly more than halfway through that cycle. In the first 5 years, our targets are to take these vaccine candidates, almost all of which, with the exception of a couple of the MERS vaccines we're supporting, are in preclinical development. And within 5 years of initiating our funding, the goal is to carry them through phase 2 in clinical trials and to establish what we have called investigational stockpiles. So these are stockpiles of the candidate vaccines that are meant for deployment into clinical trials in the event of outbreaks. I think in Cepi's next 5 years, we hope to go beyond that. I mean, ultimately, we want these products to be able to be used under some kind of regulatory mechanism, whether it's licensure or some other mechanism. But the goal is to have vaccines that can be used during outbreaks, and particularly, and I think this is really important, and it's part of Cepi's core mission. It's not just to develop vaccines, but to ensure access to those vaccines for the populations that need them as global public goods. I think there are some very promising Nipah candidates. One of the most promising, I think, in terms of being a low-hanging fruit, so to speak, which, fruit Batman. That's right. Is actually based on the licensed Hydra equine vaccine in Australia. The problem with the Hydra vaccine in Australia is that it is combined with an adjuvant that's only used in veterinary vaccines, and so it has to be reformulated. But the preclinical evidence for that vaccine against Nipah actually looks really, really positive, and so that seems like a fast track candidate.
I'm biased because I was
intimately involved with
Right.
Chris Bodo and others. And you want to talk about? Yeah, it's incredible because that soluble G vaccine against a hantavirus. Initially because for a major vaccine developer in Australia in those days, politically it would not be, a favor if we use Nipah as a model. So we use Hendra. But scientifically and surprisingly that we found out is that Nipah G antigen protects the Hendra G protects Nipah as good or better. So scientifically we still don't understand, but practically it's working like crazy. Okay, so this is the soluble G vaccine. We always say we're very proud that at least it's the first licensed vaccine for a BSL-4 pathogen, although it's for horse use, but it's still licensed, goes through all the. And so this is with the help of Cepi now. I agree, I think it will be a low-hanging fruit, because the same antigen has been demonstrated to be very, very efficacious in protection in monkey models against the Hendra and the Nipah. So it's really the formulation and then phase 1-2 trials.
So you think a Hendra G will be licensed as a Nipah vaccine?
Yeah, I
Amazing.
think that, that's because all the preclinical says that it's very effective, and we have done so much studies in all the models, and now you have the licensed vaccine have been utilized more than 600 doses.
All right, I have one more question. As you know, part of the WHO roadmap, there are a bunch of viruses, and there's disease X.
Yes.
So if we have next week disease X, would you respond in some way?
So absolutely we would, and the one aspect of our program that you mentioned briefly that I hadn't really talked a lot about is our focus on developing rapid response platforms. Nipah was disease X 20 years ago. Ebola was disease X 40 years ago. HIV was disease X. Every new emerging virus is disease X. What we don't have right now are capabilities to rapidly develop definitive countermeasures against new diseases. And so we have a whole separate arm of our funding that is focused on developing vaccine technologies that offer benefits in terms of speed in multiple dimensions. Speed in terms of time to generating a candidate vaccine, speed in terms of time to scaling up production, and speed in terms of time to providing clinical benefit. Unfortunately, commercial markets for vaccines don't really put a premium on speed of development. They just put a premium on safety and efficacy. So I think we need to make these strategic investments to drive technologies that might offer these benefits. I think if we can develop the technologies, and particularly if we can develop technologies that can be easily scaled, we potentially can offer broader social dividends in terms of democratizing access to vaccines and potentially making vaccines available for other applications like oncology. I guess your comment about the vaccine manufacturers mostly focus on the safety and the efficacy is because they're most dealing with not emerging and emergency diseases. So I hope that Cepi's platform, and so this afternoon in the vaccine talk, there will be one really they kind of put them as a KPI to say if disease X comes from the gene sequence to a vaccine candidate is 16 weeks. So this will be presented this afternoon, so I'm looking forward to that. So what I try to say is that maybe we need a slight difference of mindsetting for developing vaccines against emerging and emergency diseases, So speed is the essence,
Could I make one pitch to your audience?
Of course, of course.
We do have an open call for proposals right now, inviting candidates who have vaccine technologies or vaccine-like technologies, and that's an important, I think, qualification. If they have a technology that can provide an immunoprophylactic benefit rapidly, and the technology, particularly if the technology looks like it could be produced at a price that lower and middle income countries in particular may be able to afford, we're very interested in talking to you. And on the Cepi website, that call for proposals is available. I'd invite any of your listeners, working in scientific disciplines to take a look at it.
Well, I think it's a brilliant idea. It's been something we need, and I think it's great to see it working. So congratulations, and Linfa,
Yeah.
congratulations on a
you.
great meeting. Really
you.
appreciate it. So my guest today, CEO Richard Hatchett of Cepi. Thanks so much for joining me. Where can listeners go if they want to help out?
Yeah.
Take a look at our website. It's www.cepi.net. We have a newsletter. We're eager to connect with partners from around the world that are interested in helping address this very serious challenge for our time.
Great. So we can sample any part of the planet, and we are. We'd like to know what's there. Just a few weeks ago, I saw a paper where they went up to a glacier in the western part of China, and they dug very deep and pulled out ice cores, brought them back to the lab and thawed them, and they find viruses, and these ice cores are 15,000 years old. So we can really understand what's on the planet by doing this kind of sampling. It's quite remarkable. I mentioned at the beginning that we have viral genomes as part of our DNA, and that's illustrated here on this pie chart. As you know, our genome is 3.2 billion bases in length. It was sequenced many years ago, and many genomes are being sequenced right now because the cost has dropped substantially. The coding genes are very small, as you can see here, only 1.5%, and there are many other sequences that do other things, but I want to point you to this 8.3%, which is labeled LTR retrotransposons. We're going to talk about exactly what these are in a lecture later on. But essentially, a good fraction of these are remnants of retrovirus infections that happened long before we were Homo sapiens. They happened to our ancestors, and they were passed on down to us. And as I said, we're in a perfect moment now because we have a new virus circulating. And just this morning, I pulled these headlines down to show you what I'm going to teach you to be able to do. So here on the top, they don't go to Wuhan, don't leave Wuhan. This virus, of course, originated at a fish market in Wuhan. And the virus could mutate and spread further. Okay. And here's another article. China warns virus could mutate and spread. Where did all this come from? It came from the National Health Commission Vice Minister. There is the possibility of viral mutation. What you are going to learn in this course is that this is wrong. There is no possibility of virus mutation. It's already happening. Viruses mutate with every reproduction cycle. That coronavirus has already mutated extensively as it goes from one person to another. What they mean, of course, is that it will eventually have a mutation that does something like make it spread more.